So can we start by having you tell us your name, current position, and institutional affiliation?
Okay, I'm Carolyn Miller. I am privileged to be the SAS Institute Distinguished Professor of Rhetoric and Technical Communication at North Carolina State University. I teach in the Department of English. I work pretty closely with people in the communication department. I'm a faculty member in the doctoral program in communication, rhetoric, and digital media, which is a joint program between the two departments.
And could you talk to us a bit about some of your current research related to rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Okay, well, I'm not doing a whole lot of work now in this area, but I am working with a graduate student, Ashley Kelly, on a project for Alan Gross and Jonathan Buell's forthcoming collection on science and the internet. At least we hope this will come out. And I got into this because I've been working in the area of what some people are calling digital rhetoric. I've also been spending a lot of time on genre studies in the last number of years. And this particular project sort of brought all those things together, particularly given Ashley's particular interests. So this looks at the way that new technologies are challenging the boundaries between scientific communities, policy communities, and publics. And we're doing this by looking through the lens of genre change as a kind of way that we might, an indicator that might tell us some things about what Brian Trench has called the eroding boundaries between these communities. We also use Kaplan and Radin's notion of parascientific media to ask whether there is such a thing as parascientific genres that develop, and these would be genres that in effect sort of imitate, operate beside, complement, supplement traditional, well-established and well-stabilized scientific genres such as the research proposal and the research article. And we also are using the situation of the rapid, multi-pronged, and internet-enabled response to the Fukushima disaster to look at all these things.
Can you talk a bit about what drew you to the field? What drew you into researching rhetoric of science and technology?
Well, I had been a technical writer and editor after my master's degree in English literature, but I had also been a laboratory technician in a biophysics laboratory for quite a number of years. And I have my family, my father and mother both have chemistry degrees. My father was a chemistry faculty, so I was sort of surrounded by scientists. I married a biophysicist. And then after I did all this editorial work, that got me into teaching technical writing at North Carolina State University. And after I did that for a while, I realized that I kind of liked teaching, and if I wanted to stay in the field, I needed what I started to think of as the union card. So I went back to graduate school at Rensselaer and discovered rhetorical studies there. And in order to sort of combine my interests in teaching technical writing and teaching sort of technical and scientific students, I wanted to study the rhetoric of science, which at that time, this was 1976, was very much a sort of budding field. When I look back at the reading list for my preliminary exams in rhetoric of science, it was pretty short. And I did a dissertation on the environmental impact statement as a rhetorical genre. Went back to teaching technical writing and just got interested in continuing work in this area. A couple of the stuff that I read in graduate school that really inspired me was Kuhn's book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and also Barry Brummett's, I think it was his first publication in Philosophy and Rhetoric in 1976, some implications of process or intersubjectivity, postmodern rhetoric. And that kind of opened a lot of windows for me and seemed to make it possible to it sort of introduced the social constructionist nature of knowledge and was a kind of I guess, one of the first entries into the discussion of the rhetoric and realism debate that got started. So,
what can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it? And I wonder if you could also locate ARST within the broader universe of rhetorical studies?
Well,
or rhetoric of science within the broader universe?
I was talking last night with John Line about this and trying to remember the birth moment here. And I guess I was there, but I don't have any really strong recollection of it. I think it was at an NCA conference, and I don't know how the meeting got started or why I got involved in it in particular. I must have given a paper that was relevant. And it was a lot of people from the Pitt program, and John, who was still at Iowa. And I kind of recalled it as instigated primarily by the people at Pitt who had begun an emphasis in their doctoral program on rhetoric of science. And I kind of remember that they wanted a way to market their graduate students, to sort of put it kind of bluntly. The one thing that I do recall, and John concurs, was that I was the person who was responsible for the T in ARST. I insisted that we not just be satisfied with the rhetoric of science, but that that the rhetoric of technology was different enough that it should not be subsumed or assumed under the S in science, but so that we ought to include technology. And now we've expanded to include medicine as a distinctly different discourse in which rhetoric can play a role. How do I position all of that within a larger realm of rhetorical studies? Well, I think at first it felt like it had a hard case to make, but having, I think, successfully made that case, rhetoric of science in particular, even the rhetoric of mathematics, I guess, for some people, helped to expand the scope of rhetorical studies beyond the traditions of public address. Now, that was going on in other fields as well, with the Wingspread Conference challenging the restriction to public address, and I think that rhetoric of science was part of that much larger expansion of rhetorical studies that really started in the 60s with all of the rhetoric of the streets, the rhetoric of the demonstration, the rhetoric of popular media. So I think it was just part of that very large expansion that proceeded slowly and incrementally, but looking back on it now, that's the way I'm seeing it.
So you noted that you're the person responsible for turning ARST into ARST by adding the T.
Yeah.
Some of the other interviewees have suggested that there's relatively little on rhetoric of technology.
Yeah.
That really it's been rhetoric of science has received the lion's share of our attention.
Right.
Do you want to say something about that, or what?
Yeah. I've puzzled about this myself, and I think in part it's because the rhetoric of technology is a lot harder to locate for the critic. With the rhetoric of science, we have texts, and they're public texts. They're archived, and you can identify the authors, or at least the putative authors of them. With technology does not organize itself around texts, and the texts that there are they're in corporate files. They're not nearly as easily accessible to us. They become public when disasters happen. So, there was a number of articles about the Challenger disaster, and that was because all of those memos came out of the file cabinets with the Presidential Commission and the investigations. So I think that's one reason why it's harder to do rhetoric of technology. Another way of approaching that question is to think in more materialist terms, to move away from the text as the be-all and end-all of rhetorical studies. And I'm fond of quoting Langdon Winner's, the title of Langdon Winner's article that asks, do artifacts have politics? And my sort of parallel question is, well, if they have politics, then they have rhetorics. So we can look at the rhetoric of material objects and the technological systems that we surround ourselves with. But again, I think that's a less direct kind of work. And I think that might develop further with the move towards materialist rhetorics, because I think that's a kind of consistent way of looking at the rhetoric of technology.
So we are celebrating the 20-year anniversary of ARST. Looking back over the 20 years of the field, what significant tensions or intellectual sticking points stand out for you?
Well, I don't have a whole lot to say about this, but I think the realism relativism discussion that happened early on, I think was a significant moment that played out over time in the pages of a number of journals, and that still isn't fully settled. People are still accusing each other of being total relativists or total realists. So I think taking simple positions on that is still is still not productive, but is still maybe tempting. I think that the sort of incomplete relationships between rhetoric of science and technology and more general science studies, sociology of science, philosophy of science, history of science, and the analogous studies of history. We've never had clear relationships with those fields. As Leah Ceccarelli has said, and others, we tend more to be importers than exporters, and I think that's still a bit troublesome. Why we haven't solved that problem, I don't know. Maybe it's just part of rhetoric's general reputation in the academic landscape. And then I guess the other sort of general issue that seems to me we're still kind of wrestling with is the internal rhetoric and external rhetoric division, with some people preferring to focus on internal rhetoric of science, and others, and I think this was a somewhat later movement, looking to the relationship between science and the public. I see those as kind of two branches that are playing out and I think need to perhaps interact with each other more than they do.
What were the biggest challenges facing the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine as it began to develop? And what do you see as some of the biggest challenges moving forward?
Well, I think one challenge, and I think it was an early challenge, I think it remains a challenge, is that if you're going to do this, you have to know something about the science or the technology that you're interested in exploring. And so that requires a kind of double investment of time that some scholars aren't willing or able to make. So you need to learn something about the history, the conceptual shape, and the controversies of a scientific field or a technology-related field. And some of the most influential work that we have is from those who have either switched fields, started out life as a biologist or a physicist and got interested in history and rhetoric, or those who have some kind of double training. And I see this in my own students, that it slows them down a little bit, and some of them it will simply deter. They'll change subjects if the investment seems not worth it to them. I think that's really all I have to say on that particular question.
So what do you see as your biggest contribution to the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine? And could you put it in conversation with some of the larger themes of the field?
I guess I'll start with a kind of disclaimer. I think one of my big contributions has been that I've been a long time steady supporter of ARST. I've have attended sessions on a pretty loyal basis, I think. I started and have taught for many years a graduate level course in the Rhetoric of Science and Technology at NC State. And doing that has been one of the things that's required me to keep up with the field, perhaps better than I might have given my other interests. That course is designed for the master's students in our technical communication program, so it tends to be kind of applied. Now that we have doctoral students coming into it as well, it's become a little harder to teach. My own research in this area has been kind of scattered and opportunistic. I did a lot of work in what it must have been the 80s, I guess, on a book project that I never brought to fruition, again, because I got sidetracked onto other things. I was looking at mid-century rhetorics of technology that involved technology transfer, risk communication, innovation studies, technological forecasting, decision science. And I've published pieces of that project, but I've never brought the whole thing together. And the other studies have been kind of unconnected, so it's hard for me to say that I've made a particular mark because I haven't focused. I'll put it that way.
What do you see rhetoric adding to studies of science, technology, and medicine?
Okay, well, I was having a conversation with somebody, I guess it was last night after the session, about the Latourian movement in ROSTM. And I've never been happy with Latour. And it seems to me that what rhetoric brings, or what rhetoric adds, is exactly what Latour is missing. I think he lacks a way of explaining what he calls alliances or enrollments and commitments. He doesn't have a way of explaining persuasion, and I think that's what rhetoric gives us. Just to put a very fine point on it.
And one of the theme of the conference was invention. Is that the God term for rhetoric of science? Or are there other terms from the rhetorical lexicon that you think are particularly compelling sites of scholarly activity?
Okay, inventions certainly, and all of the paraphernalia that goes along with that, the topoi, the stacies. What else? Well, at this point, and this may be a very recent development, there's been a lot of interesting work on delivery in light of the new technologies, and I think that that's one of the areas of scientific rhetoric that the internet is changing, and so delivery may be another. Again, I think other disciplines have ways of slightly different ways of explaining that in terms of circulation and I guess what Latour calls translation. And whether rhetoric has something distinctive to add there, I think that remains to be seen. I think rhetorics, and again, I don't know whether you want to bring this under the scope of invention, but the traditional appeals, the importance of ethos, again, a kind of subtle and nuanced understanding of ethos as involving a good deal more than credibility. And I think there's some interesting things to be said about the role of pathos in apparently logos-driven discourses. So, I think those are other things that rhetoric brings.
So that's a good list of what rhetoric brings. What does science as a domain of study bring to the study of rhetoric? Other than a kind of an endless set of objects of inquiry. Well, the way I thought about it early on is that it does tend to pose itself as the hard case, that if science, which has always presented itself as the least rhetorical of domains,
can be shown to be rhetorical, then we've sort of won that conversation. I'm less enamored of the kind of argument that Randy Harris made in the pre-conference about scientizing rhetoric. So I think that a kind of science envy is not a productive strategy for humanities disciplines. I mean, I think there are other strengths that we shouldn't give up in an aim to be more predictive, more explanatory, more manipulative, perhaps.
Can you talk about the telos of your own work, or perhaps what you think the telos of Rhetoric of Science should take? You know, who should be our audience? Is it other scientists? Is it just other scholars? Is it the public at large?
Yeah. Well, I think that was one of the very interesting discussions that we had in the pre-conference. My own work has pretty much always envisioned as its audience other rhetoricians, other rhetoricians of science, and perhaps somewhat more broadly other rhetoricians beyond that. But in taking our work beyond the sort of the safety of our academic peers, I've always had a bit of ambivalence, and I've learned that ambivalence from my teaching experience, where if you're teaching engineers or scientists how to communicate more effectively in the careers that they imagine for themselves in industry or in scientific fields, are we teaching students to fit in to those environments? In other words, are we teaching them the norms and standards of the corporate environments that they'll go into, where there are admittedly counterproductive practices, practices that people are not happy with, and yet they cannot seem to revise or improve. So do we teach them to fit into those environments, or do we help them try to adhere to some other norms that are somehow better? Where do those norms come from? Is there a set of, does rhetoric as a discipline, is it able to provide a set of norms that should prevail elsewhere? I've never been real comfortable with that. And yet I think that we can evaluate the effectiveness of the practices that we see around us. So I think there's a real kind of dilemma there, almost a kind of catch-22 in terms of a teaching agenda. And I think that also, at least it inhibits me a bit from feeling comfortable in taking our work to scientists and to the public and saying, here, let me intervene, let me improve something that's going on. My one experience in working closely with scientists was as on a very large grant proposal at NC State a number of years ago. This was a multi-million-dollar, multi-year NSF proposal to create a Center for Safe and Competitive Nuclear Power. I wrote the section of the proposal on risk communication. I learned an awful lot about risk communication and the social science work that had been done on that, and it seemed to me that was simply reinventing what rhetoricians had known for centuries. But I found myself constantly positioned as the PR agent to sell nuclear power to an unwilling public. And I felt extremely uncomfortable with the way this whole project was turning out. Fortunately for me, it didn't get funded, so I never had to face that. But I think this is a kind of constant temptation and what's the word I'm looking for here? A constant perversion of what it is I think that rhetoric has to offer. That's going to be a consistent obstacle to our doing what I think others are urging us to do. So I'm a bit of a doubter, I have to confess.
Well, you hinted at the next question a little bit when you were talking about how the internet has opened up some space for us to think about delivery. I'd like to ask you to think of, or to share with us a little bit more about how the rise of the internet might be providing some opportunities for rhetoricians with science, technology, and medicine to revisit some of our old theories.
Right, yeah.
What are some avenues we might pursue there?
Well, I think this is a very long-term empirical question. I don't. I think there are really two questions: how do we look at all these new phenomena, and also what conceptual framework is going to be productive for doing so. And I don't think we should prejudge in advance either what's going to be interesting to look at or what conceptual framework is going to be productive in asking those questions. I think it's going to give us a lot of work to do over the next decades, at least my graduate students and other people's graduate students. How do we ask intelligent questions about the changes that we can already see happening in communication practices within science? I don't know that I have any particular insight at this point on how the new technologies are changing technological discourses. There's a kind of doubling over there, but I think even technologies that have nothing to do with new communication technologies are going to be changed by these new capacities and practices, and the way that those change corporate environments, regulatory environments, the natural environment, and the kinds of problems we're trying to solve there, and the kinds of new technologies that need to get invented to solve climate change and invasive species and health problems and so forth and so on. So I just think that there's incredible fertile ground here, and that we need to be sensitive to the need not to impose prefabricated theoretical frameworks on them without at the same time jettisoning explanatory frameworks that have been useful in the past. So I think it's going to be a kind of a negotiation and tacking back and forth between reconceptualization and learning from our history.
What future directions, either in terms of the exigencies or topics or methods, do you see for rhetoric of science?
Well, I think we just talked about a huge one there, but I don't have a whole lot to add other than what was said at the pre-conference yesterday. I think the increasing importance of visual modes of communication and multimodal, modes of communication where modes are working with each other needs to sort of tear us away from a devotion to the text and the word. And that's already happening, but I think it's going to continue. I think increasing what am I trying to say here? Ways of solving the problem I talked about before of how to take our work to other audiences and have it make a difference. The way that Leah Ceccarelli wrote, what she wrote about in her position paper in particular. Celeste Condit's emphasis on our need to internationalize and to relativize our understanding of science and its effects by in effect, doing comparative rhetorics of science, the way the cultural rhetoricians are doing. And continually interrogating our teaching practices and figuring out, because I think that's one of possibly our most important public and our most important mode of intervention is to work with students who will become the engineers and the scientists of the future, and to help them develop rhetorical sensitivity to their own and others' productions, and to the large environments in which they're going to work. So pedagogical improvement and constant updating, I think, is a very important future challenge.
Our final question is, what kind of advice do you have for young people thinking about getting into the field or in the field and starting their careers? What served you well, and what would you suggest to other people?
What served me well? Connecting with others at conferences, not working in a vacuum is certainly important. Partly it gives you access to other resources and other ideas, and it also it kept me going with the sense that there's an audience. This is a conversation we're involved in. And that there are people interested in what I might have to say, and by the same token, I can learn from what they have to say. So, not working in isolation, keeping up with the literature, which is becoming harder and harder, and just sort of realizing what some of the things that we were just talking about, the fact that there's a world of really interesting challenges opening up out there that I think can be career-making inquiries for young scholars.